Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the decriminalization of hard drugs in British Columbia. Vancouver is known for its ocean and mountain views, beautiful flowers, and is home of Canada's largest and most visible hard drug scene. Now the federal government has announced that starting early next year, adults in BC found carrying up to 2.5 grams of certain hard drugs, including opioids, cocaine, and meth, will not be subject to arrest or charges, and those drugs will not be seized. Instead, police will provide information on available services and, if requested, support in connecting with those services. Here today to discuss this controversial proposal are two experts, and we're joined first by Professor Ben Perrin. Ben, thank you so much for joining me today. First, I want to get your reaction to this news about British Columbia's and I guess the federal government's plan to decriminalize hard drugs. What's your reaction?
Well, it's a start. We've had a century-long experiment with drug prohibition, with criminalizing people who use drugs, with trying to threaten or punish them with stopping using drugs. It's been a very costly, catastrophic disaster across North America and around the world. The war on drugs has been going on for decades, and it has only made things worse. That's what the evidence shows us. It's actually led to increased availability and increased potency of drugs. That's on the supply side. And on the demand side, we know that incarcerating people who have substance use disorders directly contributes to their death. Research shows that you're 50 times more likely when you're forced to go through a detox in prison, essentially, because this is a medical condition. It's a chronic relapsing condition. And so I don't believe prison should be a death sentence for someone who has a substance use disorder. And we need to have policy based on compassion and evidence.
So there's been some criticism of this move on multiple fronts. First, let's address the criticism that the 2.5 gram threshold is still too low, that this will continue to result in criminalization of many people who are addicted to drugs and often carry amounts of drugs greater than that quantity.
Right. So we really do need to listen to people who are using substances. And there's a drug policy coalition that made a recommendation for a certain threshold that was higher than that. The BC government lowered that, asked for that, and then the federal government approved something even lower. So what we have is a threshold that we're being told by people who use drugs is too low. They're using for their personal use. Now, the risk is this thing could backfire big time if you set it too low. What happened when the global war on drugs got really good at seizing hundreds of tons of heroin? As organized crime doesn't just pack up their bag and go home, they created fentanyl and carfentanil, which are synthetic drugs, which are 50 to 100 times more powerful than heroin, naturally occurring heroin. And so the problem is if you say you can only have this quantity of drugs, that increases the incentive for even more potent drugs. So if you could have that much, fentanyl, well, now I can't have that much fentanyl. I can only have half that quantity. So then we'll mix some carfentanil in, which people have seen Jurassic World. That's what they used to sedate a T-Rex in that movie. And in real life, it's used to sedate elephants and rhinoceroses. And it's found in autopsy reports of people who have overdosed and died. So we don't want to get this wrong. We've got to either go towards a path of compassion and understanding and supporting people to stay alive. The alternative is to roll the dice with toxic street drugs. And that has been a total disaster in Canada and the US.
I want to ask about how much this is actually going to change. I mean, it's no secret that there has been open drug use on the streets of the downtown east side for years, and that has been increasing. Is this actually going to change much, given that it's questionable how much enforcement was actually taking place in the first place?
Yeah, so what the police were doing is, even if they were not charging, and there were still charges that are happening or is threatened, is they would seize drugs and crush them under their feet. There's also ongoing harassment of people who are on the street. We had a case this week in BC Supreme Court. A judge threw out a case because the police had searched someone unconstitutionally. They said the reason was the person looked scruffy and gaunt. Basically, they looked like a drug user, and that was the grounds to do a strip search on them. So this is the kind of enforcement that we've seen. What the research shows is criminalization contributes to a couple things. So even just the fact that it is still illegal means that people are more likely to use their drugs alone because they don't want others around who could, report on them perhaps, or be in breach of conditions like they not use drugs if they're on release. And it encourages them to use faster. So just because the VPD has had a policy of not actively prosecuting small amounts for simple possession, people would still actively use those outside of, police vision and sight and things like that. It also has implications for criminal records, employment.
Right.
There's a whole cascading set of factors.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing news that the British Columbia and federal governments are going to be decriminalizing small amounts of hard drugs, which is intended to deal with the opioid crisis and drug crisis in downtown Vancouver. Professor Perrin, I want to put to you some of the other arguments. What do you think of the argument made by people who would rather see mandatory treatment, mandatory rehab for people who are addicted to drugs, and the concerns of these proponents, and including people who live in Vancouver, who are concerned that if there aren't consequences or criminalization of open drug use, that the downtown east side could become an even bigger drug magnet and that the problem could get worse? How do you respond to that?
Well, certainly there needs to be a lot more done to support folks to get into housing. The housing first strategies work. That's been proven to work to reduce criminality and reduce overdose deaths. So there's a number of policy solutions that are also necessary and available.
Can you just explain what a housing first strategy, what does that involve?
Sure. Yeah, so housing first is an evidence-based strategy which basically looks at a complex a group of people like you find in the downtown east side. And many housing options in North America require you to first not be on any drugs at all. And if you're found with drugs, you're kicked out. Housing First says for a specifically vulnerable population, we are first going to provide you with housing and not first require you to stop using drugs. And once you have a safe place to live, a place for your things, a clean shower, you're going to be in a better place to be able to enter into treatment or rehabilitation and get the trauma counseling that is often necessary and is at the root, by the way, of most of the drug use that we see. It's trauma. These are not party drugs. Fentanyl is a pain reliever. It's an opioid which was created for palliative cancer care. So getting back to your question about forced treatment, I kind of first want to go to whoever says that. What do you mean by forced? Do you mean like literally like taking someone from the street, police or mental health, and locking them in a room so they can't use drugs? Is that what you're saying? Like, I would ask the question, what do you mean by that? And any kind of a detox only program that is not recommended by the Canadian Medical Association Journal guidelines. The British Medical Association Journal has also published a study found that those who completed a 28-day detox program, even voluntarily, are actually more likely to overdose and die than people who did not. And the reason for that is that your tolerance to these synthetic opioids rapidly declines over days and weeks, so that when you do relapse, it's a chronic relapsing condition, you're significantly more likely to die. So if we want to accelerate the overdose death rates, then forced detox is a really good way to kill people. What does work is evidence-based treatments like Suboxone, methadone, combined with housing, combined with psychosocial support, counseling, helping people to get employment. Those are the things that help.
One of the other things I know that British Columbia and Vancouver have been experimenting with is this proposal of safer supply. How does that fit into this type of policy world? And what's your view on that approach?
Yeah, if you just decriminalize street drugs, but you don't provide people with an alternative, then you still have at the core of the problem is still there. It's that you have substances of unknown potency and unknown contents. And so you literally have no idea what you're getting. Every single drug in British Columbia, except for cannabis, has been contaminated with fentanyl. So my research involves speaking with police, addictions experts, people who use drugs. They do the drug test, they do undercover drug buys. That's the evidence we have. We also see it in coroner's reports. So people who buy what they think is ecstasy, it's got fentanyl mixed in. So you have no idea of what is in your drugs. And so the idea behind a safe supply is that for people who are already going to use drugs, these are sometimes people with like 20 or 30 year long histories of chronic hard drug use, providing them with a substance that they actually know what's in there is a safer option than roll the dice and play Russian roulette with whatever happens to be on the street that week.
So is that not an option available for younger users or people who don't have this extended history of drug use? Is it only for
It's limited.
Okay.
Yeah, it's limited. So this is what I'm calling for in my research, and what the majority of public health experts have argued for, is a regulated safe supply. Regulated means you'd have to have access to it through some sort of medical professional of some kind. Beyond that would be legalization, like we have with alcohol and cannabis, and that's not something that I advocate for. You would not just be able to walk into a store and get fentanyl or cocaine.
Right. We've only got about 30 seconds. Is part of the problem stopping the supply coming into the country, or is that off the table?
Not at all. Waste of time. Good luck. And even if we did, it can be made with college level chemistry equipment and legally available materials, like in my basement. I confirmed that with the U.S. National Livermore Security Lab. So good luck.
That's all the time. That's all the time we've had. But thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a recent announcement that small amounts of hard drugs will be decriminalized in British Columbia. I'm joined now by Michael Schellenberger, author of the book San Francisco and former California governor candidate. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. I want to start by getting your reaction to the announcement in British Columbia on the decriminalization of these hard drugs. What is your take?
Well, I think it's a problem when we haven't created a proper addiction care system. And so what's happening in British Columbia is very similar to the situation in the West Coast of the United States, where basically you have open air drug scenes that have taken over large parts of the downtowns. That's the case in Vancouver, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, much of Oakland. And it's now spreading throughout the rest of the country. We know from Europe that you have to shut those open air drug markets and also drug scenes, which means sort of a party scene. We sometimes refer to them as homeless encampments, where people suffering from late stage drug addiction and untreated mental illness are basically self-medicating and dying at very high rates. And so that's not safe for the people in them. We know that 3 times more people die who are unsheltered homeless than die in shelters. We're also dealing with very hard drugs now, methamphetamine and fentanyl, but even the marijuana is stronger, and it's all layered on top of long-standing alcohol abuse. So the solution is to do what they did in Amsterdam, which is you shut down the open-air drug scene. People don't have to go into rehab, but they can't be living on the street and doing drugs. It's not safe for them. It's not safe for anybody else. I think this idea that it's okay to just promote these drugs, to decriminalize them, belies the reality that we've seen, which is that, in fact, you need to stigmatize drugs like tobacco, like alcohol, as we've done. That's how we've successfully reduced smoking in Western societies. We're going in the opposite direction with these harder drugs, where the people are being enabled to do them. And in some ways, you see this war, this anti-stigma efforts, where people want to basically normalize the use of these very dangerous and deadly drugs.
So I'm curious, when you say close the open air drug scenes, which obviously I think people in Vancouver, a lot of them would be happy to not see that anymore. But where do the people who are there, living there, where do they go? Are you suggesting they should go to prison or to rehab? Or I know there's the Housing First initiatives, which would put people into government-funded apartments. Like, where are you suggesting they go?
Well, so I think it's important to keep in mind that when you're dealing with people engaged in self-destructive and broadly destructive, societally destructive antisocial behaviors, we always need to use carrots and sticks. So we need to reward good behaviors and discourage bad behaviors. That's what they've done in the Netherlands and Portugal and Japan. Every civilized society in the world does the same thing. So nobody has to go into rehab. Nobody has to go into a homeless shelter. But you can't live on the streets. We need to enforce those laws. We need to make clean, basic, and safe shelter available for everybody. We need to make drug rehabilitation available for everybody. There is a role for medically assisted treatment, either through methadone or Suboxone. That's totally standard medical practice. I don't know anybody who opposes that, nor do I know anybody who opposes the use of Narcan to save people's lives from overdose. But what's really being debated here is whether or not we want to destigmatize these hard drugs and normalize their use. That's not something that Portugal did. That's not what Amsterdam did. We need to stigmatize addiction and untreated mental illness. We need to reward people who are getting help and getting on the road to recovery. So traditionally what you do is you say, look, if you don't want to sleep on the street and you have nowhere else to go, you can go into the shelter. If you would like your own apartment unit, you may earn that through abstinence or through compliance with psychiatric medicine.
And shelters that allow drug use, do homeless shelters allow drug use in them? I thought that a lot of them don't allow that at all.
Well, look, I think on this issue, you're going to need to be realistic. And that means that you're going to get, if you assume that the vast majority of people living on the street are there because of their drug addiction, if they're going to go into shelter, they're going to need to continue to use. But I don't think that you want to create an open drug scene indoors and sort of normalize it and enable it. You need to encourage people to get clean, to get into recovery, to get on. I mean, we need to affirm the value of human life. And that means not enabling people to just live and die as addicts. It's a terrible life. Rates of sexual assault and abuse are very high in that life. So we need to use carrots and sticks. You know, you're dealing with sick people. These are not hardened sociopathic criminals for the most part. There are some of those people, and they need to be dealt with in different methods. Mm-hmm. But for your average 25-year-old homeless drug addict, many of them just need to be mandated drug rehabilitation. Efforts need to be made to reaffiliate them with family and friends.
We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the proposal to decriminalize hard drugs in British Columbia to deal with the situation in large part on the downtown east side of Vancouver. Michael Schellenberger, in the last segment, you mentioned mandated rehab, mandated treatment. So what would that look like exactly?
Well, look, I should say, too, that, I don't think addiction itself should be against the law. If you want to be a drug addict and smoke fentanyl all day long in the privacy of your own home, I think that's a terrible choice. But I don't think we should expend law enforcement resources on arresting you. However, if your addiction has led you to camp in public, defecate in public, use drugs publicly, engage in other destructive behaviors, then you should be arrested. You should be evaluated by a social worker or a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, and you should be given the choice. You can either stop your behavior, you can accept shelter, you can accept a medical care and treatment, or if you continue with those illegal behaviors, then yes, there should be consequences, including potentially jail. Many, many addicts who have achieved recovery say that they needed to be have the threat of jail in order to achieve recovery. So by not requiring that, by not enforcing laws, by exempting people from laws because they are addicts is irresponsible. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the rest of the society.
So decriminalization, it's often framed as the compassionate choice. So I wanted to get your view on that. Do you think decriminalization is compassionate? And how do we address the opioid crisis in a compassionate way that might not include decriminalization?
Well, I think that, I don't think that we need to be prioritizing law enforcement responses to people who are addicts and are not breaking any other laws. I think this really comes to the issue of when people are engaging in destructive behaviors publicly. Like I say, I'm a liberal in my compassion, I'm a libertarian in my love of freedom, and I'm conservative in that I think you need civilization and you need law and order in order to have both of them. So I think the key here is, are you engaged in other destructive or antisocial behaviors that are breaking other laws, and are they motivated by your addiction? If that's the case, then you need to be mandated care. Marijuana has been decriminalized in the Netherlands. They've had pretty good results with that. There are some circumstances in the Netherlands where they have supervised drug consumption, but they're always trying to move people into recovery. The goal is recovery. The goal is not addiction maintenance. It's a very cynical view of humans. I think we need to look at our brothers and sisters who are suffering from addiction as fellow humans. We need to see their potential to recover and help them to achieve recovery. So I think that that's the main question. Do you need to decriminalize? Do you need to just enforce laws better? I think that depends a lot on how they do it as much as whether they do it.
One of the new initiatives in Vancouver kind of goes beyond the decriminalization. There's a move for something called safer supply, which would be sort of a government-regulated supply of fentanyl, actually. to ensure that it's not at a dose that would be easier to overdose on. And this would be for sort of hardened addicts. Do you have a perspective on that? We've got about a minute left.
I think that the Netherlands has had the right approach for a very small number of people. I believe it's under 100 people. They do allow some supervised drug consumption with supply provided by the government, but that's only for people for whom Suboxone and methadone and the path to recovery has repeatedly failed. You've got to try to get people into recovery first. You can't go and just start prescribing fentanyl to anybody who wants it. That's a recipe for absolute disaster and death.
And what about your view on the Housing First strategy? Just 30 seconds. It's another initiative in Vancouver.
Well, housing should be used as a reward for people making progress on the path to recovery and abstinence and sobriety. It should not be given as a reward for addiction or for antisocial destructive behaviors. So that's the key. The public has very limited apartment units for people. They should be given as a reward for good behaviors, not as a reward for bad behaviors.
Thanks so much, Michael, for coming on today to share your perspective. It's an important one to hear. We've heard today about Vancouver's downtown east side, which in many ways is the heart of Canada's opioid epidemic. What does compassion require us to do? Does it mean decriminalization, mandatory treatment? Does it mean safe supply? And how do we help people who are addicted to drugs and prevent more people from becoming addicted? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.